And we're back like we never left. This is episode 108 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me here. Now we have reached Monday evening in New York. If you're checking out this episode on the YouTube channel or enjoying the content, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, turn on those notifications. Or if you're catching up with this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, click like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. So today marks, sadly, 30 years since the world lost not really a national treasure as he was Canadian, a treasure, period. In John Candy, who died 30 years ago today from a heart attack while finishing up work on an unsuccessful film he made with Richard Lewis, who just passed last week, called Wagons East, a movie I've never been able to bring myself to watch. John Candy was unique. There really isn't anyone who compares. He was someone who was a comic actor, not a stand-up comedian. He was a sketch comedy actor, as was Bill Murray in Saturday Night Live. Candy, as a Canadian, cut his teeth on a famous, it was like the, I don't want to say, it wasn't a Canadian Saturday Night Live, but it had elements of Saturday Night Live. And you had actors such as Eugene Levy and Andrea Martin and Catherine O'Hara. You had huge, huge talents. Arguably, I mean, you could kind of stack up the casts of both shows, but SCTV gave John Candy the kind of platform to show his stuff to a wider audience. And then he started appearing in movies. The thing is, most people don't immediately come off of, for example, a TV show and star in movies. Adam Sandler pretty much got to do that. He went from SNL right to starring in Billy Madison, for example. And Will Ferrell didn't exactly do that. It took Will Ferrell a little bit. He had small roles in earlier movies, and then suddenly he was headlining films. In the case of John Candy, he was in Spielberg, one of Spielberg's lesser films, 1941, and he had a role in The Blues Brothers. And then he was cast in a key supporting role in Ivan Reitman's Stripes, which is a movie that was a huge box office hit. It's really not that good. It's almost shocking that it was as big a hit because it's not that good. Bill Murray's character is just basically, he really doesn't have that much to recommend him. It's Bill Murray ad-libbing his way through, and it works, but there's a lot of stuff that takes place in the movie where you're just scratching your head saying, what? What? But John Candy, in a significant supporting role, is hilarious. And I would argue that he's the highlight of the film. He certainly makes a greater impression. Harold Ramis is the co-lead along with Bill. Bill Murray is always amazing. I'm saying that his character, John Winger, the character is absurd. And I feel like it kind of hurts the film. Maybe in that case, it would have been better if he just read the script. Because there's a lot of moments where Murray is delivering lines and it feels like the other actors are trying to stick to the script. And it just doesn't always work. Like Warren Oates as the drill instructor, the big toe, Sergeant Hulka. Warren Oates was not one for ad-libbing. He was a very serious guy. And I feel like some of the static between the characters, it sort of works because Warren Oates is probably saying, what the fuck is this kid doing? But John Candy has a moment in that film where, he's a very young man. He was probably around 30 when the movie was shot. And he was overweight. And he basically describes why he wanted to join the army. And he says, I want to be a lean, mean, fighting machine. And it's a line that gets repeated later in the film. And he has such a joy to his line readings and how he's coming across. Maybe he didn't think that he was going to go any further. Maybe he was just grateful for this opportunity and said, hey, got a pretty big role in a movie that might end up being a hit. So he springboarded from that into bigger and better things. Still didn't get a lead on his own in a major Hollywood film. But if we fast forward to the first movie of his that I saw, which was on HBO, another movie that I don't unabashedly love, that I, as a Gen Xer, am supposed to. I like it, and it's ironic because I consider myself a Chevy Chase fan, like first generation Chevy Chase, not the Chevy from Community who had problems with the cast and all this sort of shit. But he had a small role in National Lampoon's Vacation, where he plays a guard at Wally World. And even in that tiny role, John is able to craft a character who feels like he has more than one dimension, with the weird accent, the hair, and the glasses. There's whole chunks of that movie that are just not that interesting. Aunt Edna, Cousin Eddie, it's okay. Christy Brinkley is, of course, the highlight. This is crazy, this is crazy, this is crazy. Candy moved on from his small role in Vacation and played a big role, a bigger supporting role than he had in Stripes, for a movie which also it's very well remembered, but if we kind of assess it, it's not that good. And that is Ron Howard's 1984 film, starring a very young and rapidly rising Tom Hanks. And Hanks's performance is funny. And Eugene Levy, John Candy's old buddy, who he would work with again in the future. Eugene Levy, to me, steals that film as Walter Kornbluth. Every moment that Eugene Levy is on screen, he's a fucking riot. And he just takes over. Whenever he shows up, it's him. So you have Tom Hanks, the star, Alan Bauer, who's not really coming across as a star, John Candy, who is coming across as a star in a supporting role as the brother, and a very young and spectacularly attractive, if we're being honest, Daryl Hannah as the, can I say the word mermaid? She plays a mermaid. And it's a sweet and gentle and kind-hearted, whimsical story. Comical villains, all of that. But my issue with the movie has always been the ending. And it's strange when you watch a movie and it's supposed to be a happy ending. And I remember watching it, it looked like a fucking tragedy to me. There's nothing happy about that ending. If you're not familiar with Splash, I'm not going to spoil it. It's on Disney Plus. They did a remake, they did Splash 2, reboot. I watched the movie and I kept repeating it and trying to figure out, what am I missing? This is horrible. This is not a happy ending. This fucking sucks. The 10-year-old kid version of this fucking sucks. Oddly enough, I didn't see Summer Rental until recently. And that's a movie that many fans of John Candy will say that's one of his signature performances. The harried everyman. Yes, he's roly-poly, but he's a guy that we can identify with, we can get behind. Brewster's Millions, I watched at least 10 times when it was on HBO. It's Richard Pryor's film, ostensibly, but Candy is so solid, he's so strong, and so funny. He doesn't physically fit the part of anybody who would be a catcher in baseball, but he pulls it off. Just as Richard Pryor pulls off the idea that he could have been a pitcher, he doesn't really look like an athlete. But Brewster's Millions, although not a great film, is well remembered, and it is one of those movies that HBO and Cinemax in the 80s, on a long list really of movies like Cocoon, Robert Redford in The Natural, that you could always seemingly find them on HBO or Cinemax at least once or twice a week if you were looking. Brewster's Millions I saw over and over. And remember how good John Candy is in his role. Now here, I never saw Volunteers, another movie that some segments of Generation X say is a classic. Another movie that he did with Tom Hanks. The two guys had a great rapport, but the reality is John Candy would have a great rapport with a table. He was so easy, had such an ingratiating way about him that you just wanted to like him. You wanted to embrace him. He was funny and he was relatable. And he was never less than human. And even in a silly movie like Summer Rental, there's a moment early in the film where his character gets a sunburn. And just the way he moves around, and because he is a bigger guy and he looks like he's uncomfortable a lot of the time in general, you feel the sunburn. He's relatable. He's an everyman. He could be one of us. He doesn't look like a movie star. And in Summer Rental, here he is headlining a major studio comedy. So what I would say, if someone were to ask me the question, what is the stupid, funniest movie you've ever seen? A film that is laugh out loud hysterical, but arguably unbelievably stupid and could never be made now. And when I say it could never be made now, I'm not talking about woke or the thought police or anything like that. I mean, this movie could not be made now because nobody would have the guts to do it, and it wouldn't come across the same way as in the 80s when they're just ripping sacred cows left, right, front, and center. Nobody gave a shit. Now it would be like, yeah, we really can't do that. Just because you say you can't do something now doesn't mean that anybody is keeping you from doing it. Times change, and what was funny then might be funny now, but maybe it wouldn't. Maybe we don't need to go in this direction. But the movie I'm talking about is Armed and Dangerous, which pairs John Candy and, again, Eugene Levy, a phenomenal, fantastic comic actor who usually plays the straight man. He normally plays reactive characters. As we saw on Schitt's Creek, where his character is very reactive. He's reacting to crazy circumstances surrounding him. In the movie Splash, he's more active. He's driving some of the kind of villainous aspects of it, even though his character is not, to call him a villain would be a stretch. He's just a clown, a flat out clown. But Armed and Dangerous finds John Candy as a police officer and a good cop who stumbles onto an embezzlement and a corruption scandal and gets run out of the force. Eugene Levy plays the worst attorney I've ever seen in a movie in which a primary character, is an attorney. He's horrific. He's horrible. He makes William Hurt in Body Heat, seem like Spencer Tracy in Inherit the Wind, or, like that level of brilliant lawyer. Paul Newman in The Verdict times 1,000. So John Candy gets fired from the police force, ends up working for a security company. And Eugene Levy, whose career as a lawyer appears to be over, like he's so bad they're threatening to disbar him. Like, I don't ever want to see you again in this town. You're that bad of a lawyer. It's an embarrassment to the legal profession. They go to work for a security company, and lo and behold, because it's a movie, the same embezzlement, corruption scam, now John Candy has an opportunity to do something, not as a cop, but as a security guard. And the film goes to places you're not expecting it to. It goes to places where there are drag queens who are very thirsty. And Meg Ryan, who looks like she's college age, is in the movie. And Robert Loggia, the great old actor, plays a crime boss, and he's completely wasted. A terrific actor, another guy, Kenneth McMillan, plays Meg's dad, and he's kind of wasted. The movie doesn't really take it. Larry Henkin, another kind of comedic actor, he was in Friends. The movie doesn't really do anything other than allow John Candy to be hysterically funny throughout the film as he's driving the action, and Eugene Levy is basically the straight man, just out of control, apoplectic. Why the fuck am I listening to this guy? And it is one incredible comedic scene after another. And an 80s actor whose name many of you probably don't know, Steve Railsback, shows up at the end in a humongous truck to help our intrepid heroes save the day. And it is a scream. There are so many moments in the movie that are inappropriate, but we don't give a shit. It's okay. We understand the movie was made in 1985, 86. They're making fun of people into fitness. They're making fun of people who are not into fitness. They're making fun of gay people. They're making fun of straight people. They're making fun of everyone. Everyone feels the flame in this movie. Everyone gets flamed in this film. And It wasn't a huge hit at the box office. It made money. And when it appeared on HBO Max about maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago, a new generation of people saw it and took to social media. It's like, why didn't anybody tell us about this? There's a scene in the movie where John Candy and Eugene Levy are literally hiding out from the police, two of whom are corrupt, and John Candy knows it, couldn't prove it, and that's part of how he got busted down to working for a security company. So they go into a kind of adult bookstore where there's a peep show and maybe some sex going on back there. And they hide out in a peep show booth. And they're stuck there. There's nowhere to go. And John Candy and Eugene Levy's looking around, so what the hell do we do now? And John Candy with a straight face just says, give me a quarter. Now, out of context, what the hell do you mean, give me a quarter? And Eugene Levy realizes, give him a quarter so he can put it in the slot and they can watch a naked woman dance. The way the two guys start arguing over how reasonable is it that we're probably about to die and you want 25 cents so that we can they go back and forth, and the scene ends in them essentially accosting two very well dressed for the part, people who are of an alternative lifestyle. And there's no judgment in the movie other than the fact that they got to get the fuck out of there. So John Candy ends up in drag, and Eugene Levy ends up in disguise, the costumes that the people that they kind of lured and then beat the shit out of, they managed to evade capture by the police. And if you could encapsulate one of the most, it's like as inappropriate a 2 minutes of film I've ever seen, but it is absolutely hysterical. John Candy driving the action in a lead, being incredibly funny. But you know what? If you just look at the plot, it's about a cop who got screwed. He was a good cop. He knew he was right. And he maintained throughout the film, when we eliminate the kind of absurdist comedic elements, he was right. And the story, he's a lot of challenges thrown at him. It looks like they're going to die any number of times, but he finds a way. He rises and he wins. Roll credits, happy ending. And Eugene Levy might end up with Meg Ryan. Not bad. Way to go. So Candy had a small and very funny role in Little Shop of Horrors, which I think is a great film, even though there were a lot of production issues as far as the original ending, which was very dark. They ended up making adjustments. The original ending of the movie follows what the ending of the Broadway musical was. And test audiences didn't like it. Even though creatively and narratively it made the most sense, didn't work. Because the movie is so bright and bouncy and buoyant, and the performances are so energetic from Rick Moranis and Vincent Gardenia and Ellen Greene and Steve Martin, fucking incredible, and John Candy. And Bill Murray, also incredible. The movie did not need a brutal ending, and I'm glad they went with the more upbeat ending, and people who are interested can see the original ending in its entirety and imagine that that's how the film was. You're allowed to do that. The magic of the internet these days, right? You don't have to go out and buy a DVD or a bootleg or whatever. You can see it for yourself. So in 1987, John Candy made what I believe to be, I believe it was his best year. Because he did two movies that both of them I unabashedly love and would have them in my John Candy top 5. Spaceballs, Mel Brooks's comical satire, homage, ode to mostly Star Wars, but a little bit of Star Trek. John Candy plays Barf, a Mog, half man and half dog. Even if you don't get the Star Wars references, and the reality is, younger generation watching the movie, there is a lot of dated, topical material that isn't going to land, but I would argue the film still works. Because the story, the kind of bedrock of the story, the skeleton of the narrative follows Star Wars. And that is a narrative that still works. Candy is hysterical. He is a scream as this character. It's almost like a Cowardly Lion type of character in the world of Star Wars. And he and Bill Pullman, another actor who would go on to greater glory, President Whitmore in Independence Day, among many others. Spaceballs is a treasure. It is a classic comedy and one of the best films Mel Brooks ever made. And I would put it in the top 10 as far as, film comedies of the 80s. Now, is it as laugh out loud funny as Armed and Dangerous? I mean, that's all subjective. It's more of a straightforward comedy. It is vulgar, nowhere near as vulgar as Armed and Dangerous. But there is a lot of stuff in Spaceballs that now you watch, you say, ooh, that's pretty impressive. They got away with this in 1987. Yeah, it is. They did. But what many consider to be John Candy's best film and probably best performance is the movie that he made for the Thanksgiving season in 1987 with Steve Martin, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. This is another situation where it's ostensibly Steve Martin's movie. Steve Martin is the nominal star. We follow his character. We only meet John Candy's Del Griffith through Steve Martin. I am as big a Steve Martin fan as anyone. I did an episode devoted to him. That is how big of a fan of Steve Martin I was and am. It's John Candy's movie. John Candy steals the show. When we start to get the idea that there's a lot more to his character than it seems, that his character has areas of wounding and hurt that you don't expect in what appears to be a silly road movie comedy. And what Candy does as Del Griffith in this film is he finds a heart behind a man whose life has been destroyed by fate and circumstance and really just wants to make a connection. And Steve Martin in this movie, and this is to his credit, not only does he let John Candy shine, but he plays a character that's really not a very nice guy. And I'm not sure that it was in the script that his character of Neil Page is supposed to be such an asshole. But Neil Page goes a lot of this movie where you're even almost wondering, how could this guy have the job he has? How could he have the wife that he has and a family? He just seems like a fucking asshole. But Neil Page, Steve Martin's character, is redeemed by the way that he ends up embracing Del Griffith, flaws and all. And the kind of lump in the throat moments towards the end of the film are earned. And the chemistry between the two guys is amazing. And I wish that they made more movies together because Martin could interact properly with anybody on screen. And as we've seen and would continue to see, John Candy had chemistry with everybody. He just was able to connect with the people on screen in a way that you can't teach. It was just in his face, in his smile, in his body language. And Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is also an all-time, not only all-time comedy, but it's one of the best holiday films ever made. Even though in the world of this movie, it's specifically Thanksgiving, you can pretend he's trying to, that would be Neil Page, Steve's character is trying to get home for Christmas dinner. It doesn't matter. It is a great film. A laugh-out-loud, rollicking comedy with a deep sense of love and family and heart. And yeah, as I say, if anybody were to say, what's John Candy's best film performance, that's what I'm going to say Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And we did a movie with Dan Aykroyd, working with Aykroyd in '88 called The Great Outdoors. It's not that good. It's notable because you had Annette Bening, who was on the rise in a small role. I believe Annette plays Dan Aykroyd's wife, if I'm not mistaken. She's interesting to look at because you could tell that she was better than the material. The only really positive element, in my opinion, of The Great Outdoors is there is this unbelievable scene where John Candy's character eats a 96-ounce steak and wins his family a free dinner. It's like 5 minutes of the movie, and it is absolute gold. And Dan Aykroyd during that scene is fantastic. The rest of the movie is just eh. Now, here's where I'm going to part company with a lot of Generation Xers, and I'm apologizing in advance. I am not a fan of Uncle Buck. I don't like that movie. It is mean-spirited and nasty, and I do not like it. Come at me, bro. Come at me. It's not good. Yeah, the scene where he's making the pancake and to see young Macaulay Culkin, it's fine. Jean Louisa Kelly, who plays daughter, she's a terrific actress. I loved her years later in Mr. Holland's Opus. She's fantastic. Don't like the movie. Now, a terrible movie that I do like that Candy starred in was Who's Harry Crumb? The guy just couldn't stop working. Who's Harry Crumb is like a mystery with a master sleuth, Harry Crumb, at the center, played by Candy. And of course, he's the dumbest person on the planet, but somehow kicking and screaming manages to solve this wacky mystery with at Jeffrey Jones and Shawnee Smith, the actress who was very popular in the 80s. She was in the Blob remake in 1988. It is another stupid, funny movie. Candy's hair looks funny. I've got a black belt in Aikido. Yeah! And the boots to match. Not a great movie. And he played a lot of smaller roles. It's like he just couldn't sit still. And Home Alone, he was not originally supposed to be in the original Home Alone with Macaulay Culkin and Catherine O'Hara, John Hurd, whole thing. An incredible movie. But he came on and he worked for, I think, a day and a half as Gus Polinski. Polka, polka, polka. And honestly, the scenes with Catherine O'Hara struggling to get back home are difficult. They almost take you out of the humor and the madcap high wire act that the kid is pulling off with Daniel Stern and Joe Pesci's characters. But Candy is so warm, again, so warm and so inviting. In this case, working with his old SCTV castmate and friend, Catherine O'Hara. He's the highlight of the movie for me because he helps to bridge what would otherwise be very difficult territory in the movie where you have a mother who is scared shitless that something terrible has happened to her son, and she's almost right, but not for the reasons that she thinks. Now, unfortunately, John Candy was in a movie which might be the worst film, big studio film, ever released by Warner Brothers, Nothing But Trouble, with a phenomenal cast, including, again, Dan Aykroyd, his buddy, and Chevy Chase, another friend of his. He'd worked with him in Vacation, and Demi Moore, and a very young Tupac Shakur in a tiny role. Nothing But Trouble is catastrophically bad in every way. And I remember reading somewhere that Warner Brothers didn't fund Spike Lee's Malcolm X at a certain point because they were convinced that Nothing But Trouble was a better box office bet. They ended up, thank goodness, making Malcolm X anyway, but a little bit later than they would have. And I saw Nothing But Trouble when it premiered on HBO in like early 92. It's just as bad as its reputation. As much as Chevy Chase, his ad-libbing works, and the only humorous moments in the film are when Chevy clearly is throwing the script in the trash and doing his own thing. There's one moment that is funny and not really for a good reason, where we meet John Candy in drag. And it's basically supposed to be Dan Aykroyd's character's daughter. And Dan Aykroyd basically said she'd make a fine wife. She was struck dumb and mute at birth. And Chevy Chase, without breaking pose, just goes, "My kind of woman." And it's such a horrendous thing to say. And I don't know who thought that what I just told you was funny, because it's not. But it shows that even within the context of this disastrous, horrifyingly bad film, the actors were still trying. Chevy hadn't quit. Demi looks great. She doesn't really do anything. I think it was the first movie she shot after Ghost, if I'm not mistaken. It's just so bad. Two films from 1991 that I want to spotlight that Candy was in. One is a movie that I really like. It's kind of a comedy drama called Only the Lonely, where John plays a Chicago police officer. His partner, Jim Belushi, in the movie is always a treat to see, especially that era Jim Belushi. Never took a performance off. And Ali Sheedy plays a mortician who is the love interest of the story, and the great old phenomenal actress and matinee idol star from the 40s and 50s, Maureen O'Hara, plays John Candy's mom, and she is dynamite. The movie has so many great locations of Chicago Cubs and other Chicago area locations. And it didn't do that well at the box office. And I remember my dad watching it about 15 years after it came out. He didn't like it. And I was surprised because it's a movie I've seen at least 5 times start to finish. I think it's a hidden gem, very underrated. Anthony Quinn is in it. He's hilarious. It didn't quite connect with audiences. Didn't like the movie he did called Delirious. A lot of people were into it. Not so good. Now, I want to point out the one straightforward dramatic role. It's little more than a cameo. But Oliver Stone, God bless him, in this one instance, because I have a lot of issues with Oliver Stone, but not for the movie JFK, and sure as fuck not for Platoon, not for Talk Radio. But Oliver Stone, while he was casting JFK, he went out of his way to get John Candy for what he considered a very important role. He has a scene with Kevin Costner as Jim Garrison, real-life character, and it's an incredible scene. Even there, you see that John Candy in a serious role where his character is sweating profusely and he's giving information to Kevin Costner's character that he probably shouldn't. He's got great chemistry just in that one scene with Costner. And it's a shock, and it was a stunning shock for audiences of the day who had no idea that John Candy was going to be in that movie. Holy shit, it's John Candy. If this was all you had to go on, you would think, wow, that big guy is a terrific dramatic actor, isn't he? John Candy was great at everything he did, 24 frames per second. He did everything beautifully. So yes, his performance in JFK is for me, one of the highlights because it comes out of left field. You're not expecting it. Now, I mentioned how Candy passed 3 years later while working on and finishing up the movie Wagons East. Now, he had shot a film by Michael Moore, a rare feature non-documentary by Michael Moore. And by all accounts, they had a really good working relationship. Michael Moore was not as polarizing back then as he would be considered now. The only docu that he did, which really hit with people, was Roger and Me. If you go back and watch Roger and Me, it's not a polarizing film. It's nowhere near some of Moore's later work. So again, the name Michael Moore didn't mean the same thing. In 95, he was a guy, that's the guy that did Roger and Me. Because I would argue Roger and Me is one of the best documentaries ever made. It's easily top 10, maybe top 5. It is an incredible film. And Candy had finished his scenes for this movie that Michael Moore was putting together. Rhea Perlman is in it also, called Canadian Bacon. And but he passed while shooting Wagons East, which is tragic. He was only 43. And the thing is, he had lost weight. If you look at him in Armed and Dangerous, he is a lot smaller than he was in other movies of that decade. And he had some issues, and maybe he just really loved to eat, didn't like to exercise. Because he had, I believe, lost about 50 pounds while he was shooting Armed and Dangerous. He looked significantly smaller in that film than, as I say, other movies of the decade. But he plays the announcer in the 1993 film. It was a surprise kind of sleeper hit called Rookie of the Year. And not surprisingly, he's one of the highlights of the film. Every moment with John Candy, in much the way that Bob Uecker years earlier in Major League is kind of the highlight, just a bit outside. John Candy does that in Rookie of the Year, it was a surprise hit. It was a sleeper and surprise hit, and a movie that's very well remembered. As ridiculous and absurd it is, it's pitched at the level of a fantasy. So in that case, the ridiculousness is okay because the movie is not really dealing in real world science and reality. The last box office hit of John Candy's career is another Disney film, Cool Runnings, about the iconic, I think it was 1988, the Jamaican bobsled team that came out of nowhere, competing in the Olympics and all kinds of acclaim. The movie was also a sleeper hit at the box office. And it's not really, yes, John Candy is at the center, but it's not really a John Candy film. His character is important, but it's more about the guys. And yes, he has the redemptive arc. This is true. But it's about the just impossible story of this Jamaican bobsled team and this is something I will Google because I really hate giving you bad information. I want to say that they got the bronze medal, but I'm not 100% on that. Let me just check this out. Cool Runnings, bobsled. Maybe they finished fourth. Let's see. Okay, yeah, they did not medal. They did not medal. See, I was going to say bronze medal. They didn't even come close to winning a medal. It was the fact that they got there and that they competed at the highest level. There may have been another competition where they got fourth. Somehow I had it in my head that they finished fourth, but they did not medal at the 1988 Olympics. In this case, it was not whether they won or lose. It's the fact that they even played the game in the first place, and it was the 1988 Olympics. That was the one part that I got right. But that's unfortunately John Candy's last, what you would call great performance, leading performance. And the movie Canadian Bacon was not a hit. And Wagons East, his last film with the late, great Richard Lewis, was also not a hit. So we're just left with the fact of this man who he didn't live a tragic life. It's just tragic that he died. And we can say that, well, he didn't take great care of himself. But there are a lot of people who don't take great care of themselves, who are a little heavy or a lot heavy and live long lives. And he was only 43. 43. It's just tragic. He would be 73 if he were still alive today. And I wish he were. And I remember when the news came over the wires that he had passed. It was devastating. He was someone that we all identified with. And even though we never met him, we felt as if he had that ability. He was our friend too. He was our pal, our guy. John Franklin Candy. Gone 30 years ago today, but never, ever forgotten. One of the best to ever do it. A true unicorn, an incredible talent, and by all accounts, a pretty good human being too. This has been episode 108 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast, a little John Candy retrospective and tribute. But if you've caught up with this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, turn on those notifications. Or if you're catching up with this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same rule applies. Click like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode number 109 real soon. Till then,